keep saying it's about to get there. You know what, one of the best ways to stimulate the economy would be, if we really wanted to boost it, you know, I want to mention, raising the minimum wage. Why is that? Well, you're talking about a group of people, the minute they get that, they spend it. So every dollar that goes to minimum wage goes back into the economy right away. So if we really wanted to boost our economy, that could have done it by now. Anyway, I throw that in.
Yeah.
Question.
There is, and I'll just add as a caveat, so there's this debate now with people who oppose raising the minimum wage, like the CBO study that says, well, if you raised it, you could lose 500,000 jobs and won't have some negative job impact. The estimates we've seen from the Economic Policy Institute suggest that, I believe, just in Wisconsin alone, raising the minimum wage would raise wages for 600,000 people in Wisconsin. So 600,000 workers would see a pay increase if we raise it to 1010, but put $816 million back into the Wisconsin economy just from those increased wages. What I say back when they say, well, isn't there this study that says you're going to lose jobs? The great thing about there being different states that have higher than the federal minimum wage, about 17, 18 of them now, you can compare their unemployment rates to the states that have the federal minimum wage, and guess what? There is no difference. So all the theorists who come up and say, well, we're worried about it for some reason, there's actually two sets of experiments going on right now with the states that have higher than the federal minimum wage and the one that don't. And there's not a single state that has a higher minimum wage that's above if you look at the group of the ones that are the federal rate. So this argument that it's going to cost jobs is the same argument that people who oppose the minimum wage use every time. But historically, over time, and empirically and comparatively, it's just not the case. I'm sorry, you had a question.
Is it really a good idea to tie the minimum wage to an index? Because that's one of the few issues that Democrats have that will bring people out of the polls. If we tie it to an index, then we start taking it for granted like we did public unions, and then in another 2010, it's going to disappear. There's, going to vote those laws out, and we'll be sitting there on our hands with no minimum wage.
Yeah, I've had this conversation with a lot of fellow progressives who think, why would we want to give away the political golden goose of raising the minimum wage if you index it every year? Just to repeat that number, 600,000 people would get a pay increase if you raise the minimum wage to 1010, and that number will continue to likely be similar if you index it every year. Where I come down to this, I got into this not necessarily to win elections, but to improve the lives and working conditions of ordinary working class folks that I represent in Racine and across the state. And to me, it is far more important to give them a little more certainty that their wages are going to keep up with inflation, albeit an insufficient one, than it'll have it fall further and further behind. The reason the minimum wage is so, and the other reason is, politicians aren't successful about coming back regularly to raise it, right? So if you adjusted the minimum wage from 1968 to today, and what it was in 1968, I believe they say the minimum wage would be $10.50 an hour. I think $10.54, something right about there. So we've done a bad job as a country. If that's an argument, well, let's go back to it every couple of years and win some elections and raise people's wages. The reality is, we don't do it. We fail to provide those folks that opportunity. But the other reason is, again, if you look at our tax brackets, those are indexed to inflation every year. Nobody says boo about, oh, we should keep it flat for millionaires and not let it go up to 1.5 million or 1.05 million the next year because we want to keep those wages low. On all kinds of things, we index things to inflation. Why we would treat the lowest paid workers differently for the hopes of a future political benefit, for me, just doesn't outweigh it. Historically, we've shown we haven't done a good job doing it. And the last thing I'll say about it is 1010 is a better minimum wage, but it is not a living wage. And eventually, I would love for us to get to the point where we pass 1010 an hour and it's indexed to inflation. And the next debate is, it's great that we're indexing it every year, but how about we work to getting it towards a living wage? And I'd like that to be the next fight. So for all those reasons, I think putting indexing in there doesn't mean we give up the fight. I think it just gives 600,000 workers in Wisconsin a little more assurance that their minimum wage isn't going to fall further and further behind.
The point is, Don't you understand how hard it is to get low-paid people to go to the polls and vote for their own interests? They don't see it unless it's right there. It's in my paycheck if I vote for that. We can't get them to vote in any election except for president. I got the list. I got volunteers to go out. They just won't vote. But they'll vote if it's something that today will go into my pocket. I can get them out to vote, and they won't just vote for that. They'll vote for all the other issues. My point would be there's more to life than your wage. You know, there's all the other rights, you know, that are tied to that. But if we can't get people to vote, we're wasting our time.
I agree that we're only gonna win this if we get people out to vote, but I don't think we need to hold people's indexing wages as a tactic to get them to come back again. And again, historically, we haven't done it for them. We just haven't. You know, I mean, legislators see their pay go up almost every session, the cost of living adjustment, the tax brackets go up. Why we wanna treat the lowest wage workers in the hopes that it might motivate them, when there are other things that we can do to motivate them. You mentioned paid sick days, it's another one. Low-wage workers, I think it's 80% of low-wage workers in the state have 0 paid sick days. That if they get sick or their kid gets sick, they can get fired for showing, if they don't show up to work. I think there are other ways that we can pull low-wage and low-turnout voters out to the poll without holding indexing hostage. So I appreciate your comments, I just disagree.
My question is on food stamps and the statistic that you mentioned today. Is that based on from if you raise the minimum, from the minimum wage from $7.25 to $10.10, that it would go from the amount of money that would, the amount that they would be distributed, or what is their?
Yeah, so the idea is that you take people from 725 to 1010, and then there's fewer people who then qualify for, it doesn't eliminate it, but it reduces the amount of benefits.
Correct.
Whether that's through the earned income tax credit, which is a tax break that people use to supplement the income at the end of the year that we all pay for, whether it's food stamps or emergency assistance, all of those things begin to diminish. It was the Economic Policy Institute that I believe released the study. I'm pretty sure the number was 4.5 billion, it might have been 3.5, but it was a big number. And given, I mean, the interesting thing to me is how much some Republicans talk about, we need to crack down on food stamps, and Obama's the food stamp president, we really need to do something about it. Well, the minute you say, well, let's raise some wages so there's not so many people who qualify for it, they're like, oh, no. We didn't mean that. We just want to find ways to kick people off of food stamps. And so to me, I mean, you can't have it both ways. Either you don't want people to be dependent on government. If you want that to be the case, then pay them enough so that they make an honest day's pay for an honest day's work.
Are tipped workers' wages currently attached to the minimum wage so that if it
Please.
goes up?
Only one person speaking. Thank you.
I'm sorry, if you could repeat that again.
Are tipped workers' wages currently attached to the minimum wage so that if it goes up, they will go up automatically?
Yeah, so the way the federal and state bill that have passed, this is another interesting thing, is what to do with tipped workers who we make $2.35 an hour in Wisconsin. And it's been even long, I think it's 20 plus years since that wage has moved. And unfortunately what often happens at the federal level is they need to pass the federal minimum wage, right? They want to raise it. And what they'll do at the last minute is they'll cut some deal with the National Restaurant Association. Well, just leave the tip workers right where they are and give it to everybody else. And so tip workers have taken it pretty hard in the shins the last few rounds. Interestingly, there are, I believe, 8 states that have raised the minimum wage who have said, no more exemptions for tipped workers. We're not doing that anymore. We're gonna pay them a minimum wage. And you know what happens to those tipped workers? They move out of poverty very quickly. Because the reality is if you're telling somebody they're gonna work for $2.35 an hour plus tips, they're lucky if they're making minimum wage. Maybe they have a good day, maybe they're there Saturday night and they make a little bit more, but if it's slow and you only got a couple tables, you're lucky if you're making $7.25 an hour. So what our bill does, and it's again based on the federal law, is it increases the $2.35, and there's actually, believe it or not, multiple minimum wages under Wisconsin law. There's one for migrant workers, there's one for camp counselors, there's one for babysitters. I mean, it's actually more complicated than you think. But at the end of the day, what we decided to do is to say, look, let's at least get all those wages, and this is again based on what the federal law did, up to 80 cents on the dollar, and move it up, I believe 75 cents a year until it's worth 80 cents on the dollar of the regular minimum wage, and at least keep it closer, because to have one wage at $7.25 and one wage at $2.35 is just not sustainable. But the states that have raised the wages of their wait staff to coincide 100% of the other minimum wage, lots of poverty has gone down, and the restaurant business is doing better in those states than the other states in the country. Now, part of that's relative to how well their state's economy are doing generally, but it has not been this, oh my goodness, if we had to pay wait staff the minimum wage, the world would come to an end, we would go out of business. It just hasn't occurred. In fact, the restaurant industry has thrived in those states. So it's a really good question.
I was just wondering if worker productivity should be considered in the minimum wage, because as worker productivity improves, the workers should see some of it in their salaries.
I think it's definitely a commentary on wages generally in America. We actually, I just had an argument with one of my conservative colleagues in Racine who gave a thing that I heard when I was a kid, and here again, kids these days, they just don't understand the value of work. They just don't understand what it is. American workers are now the most productive workers in the world. And the big thing that has changed, depending on which metric you use, from 1973 or 1978 to the present, is workers no longer see an increased share of those profits from that increased productivity. It goes to the richest 1%. In fact, since the recovery, more than 90% of the dollars from the recovery has actually gone to the richest 1%. So your point generally about how workers should be sharing in some of the profits, the way we did in this country in the after World War II up until about 1980, it was a system that worked very well. It was the biggest, most profitable, most robust middle class in the world. Was a system that worked, but we moved away from that. Now, pegging it to the minimum wage itself would be a little bit different, because then people start talking about piecework, right? Instead of saying, well, instead of giving you a guaranteed hourly rate, I'll give you a piece rate, and you have to put so many widgets in a machine per hour in terms of how you get paid. And we found that is a model that can be very dangerous. OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Hazardous Material Health Administration, strongly advises against that, because it leads to a lot of accidents. And it's like anything else. If you could say to somebody, I want you to run your fastest mile in the next mile, they could run a fast mile, but they couldn't run a mile at that pace all day, every day. The same is true for workers and piecework. But your broader point about how workers are not sharing in this great American productivity that we have, it couldn't be more on point.
Why might that be? How could that be changed? Is it policy? Why is so much of the money going to the top 1%? Are there rules, policies?
Wow, that could be a whole different topic. I mean, I'll give you a couple of ideas of what I think they are. I mean, it's the decline of unions in the private sector. So when in the 1950s, almost half of private sector workers were represented by a union, and the other half of them didn't want to be too far behind, so they could compete. And so as productivity went up, the union would sit down across the management and say, look, you guys just made X amount. It'd be only fair if we shared in some of that productivity. The other thing, I got an alert on my phone before I started talking. The federal court has now declared that Wisconsin's limits on corporations giving directly to campaigns and campaign spending is unconstitutional. And so if you think about what happened in this state, our great progressive tradition with Bob LaFollette, who spent all this time breaking trusts and getting the railroads out of the business and sort of running the state and making corporate contributions illegal, we've now come full term with Citizens United and these other decisions where it's all holds barred for corporate contributions. And so what that means is decision makers are now thinking in the back of their mind, maybe not directly, but you're always thinking about, how are we going to win the next election? How am I going to come back? How is my side going to get the majority? And it's no longer about how many people can I give to give me, my average contribution to my campaign, I think is still about $50, $55 from ordinary average citizens, right? But if the new rules of the game are now that I can go to any corporation and say, hey, could you give me $50,000 to help me pay for my next raise? That just changes what people's priorities are. We could have a whole separate conversation about why, but I mean, I would say that those are two of the big factors right there, Citizens United, corporate giving, and then the decline of unions and workers really having a voice in the workplace have really contributed to the disparity. And then maybe we started on Wall Street and what happened with, but I mean, we've allowed this to happen, and it's gonna take a lot to change it. I think a great future topic might be the people who are doing the move to amend work. Have you done that already? All right, all right, fair enough, fair enough. Other questions?